This video is sponsored by Classic Football Shirts, the best place to get your classic and vintage football shirts. To get cheap retro Palace shirts, click the link in the description below. And for an extra 10% off, use the code CFSPJ10 at checkout. Hello and welcome to the Crystal Palace podcast. I'm Alfonso Greenbrook, and in today's podcast I'll be looking over the game against Southampton but bring you my match view, player rankings and my man of the match. As well as this, I'm also going to bring you interviews with Hodgson and Wayne Hennessey after the game. So let's begin. Goals from Danny Ings and Pierre-Emile Hojbjerg saw Palace fall to a third league defeat in a row at the expense of Southampton at Selhurst Park. Ings pounced to score his second of the season just after the break, but a penalty saved by Wayne Hennessey from Charlie Austin kept Palace in the game. However, despite the Eagles peppering the Saints' goal in the final quarter, the goal wouldn't come, and in stoppage time, Hojbjerg wrapped up the visitors' first win of the season. The first half was one that wouldn't live long in the memory, but it was Southampton who looked the most likeliest to open the scoring during it. Mark Hughes' team had been camped in the Palace half by the time the game was 20 minutes old, and Mamadou Sakho produced a fine sliding block to prevent Ings from tucking the ball home from inside the 6-yard box. Hennessey was the busier of the goalkeepers in the opening 45 minutes, and he had to tip over a 25-yard drive from Hojbjerg before making an excellent reaction save when Luka Milivojevic inadvertently sent a diving header towards his own goal when defending a Mohamed El-Niossi free kick, but the Welshman managed to claw it away from his top corner. Palace, missing Wilfried Zaha with a groin injury, threatened very little in the opening 45 minutes, with new boy Jordan Ayew looking the liveliest in his first action in red and blue. However, the best he could muster was a wild shot from distance over the bar between the Saints' attacks, whilst on the stroke of half-time, Milivojevic forced McCarthy into a comfortable first save with a booming volley. If hopes were high that the hosts would be refreshed after a 15-minute regroup, they were dashed a minute after play resumed when Southampton grabbed the lead. Cedric Soares sent in what looked to be a hopeful cross from the right, but it somehow managed to drift towards the penalty area where Ings had escaped the attention of the Eagles' defence, and he slipped it through Hennessey's legs to score in successive Premier League appearances against the Eagles. That seemed to spark Palace into life, and 7 minutes later James McArthur took aim from range and curled a shot goalwards, which McCarthy was relieved to hear thud of his crossbar, and then Benteke caused an almighty goalmouth scramble when he saw a low shot blocked by the ex-Eagles keeper. And in the resulting scruffle, Patrick Ayew and McArthur all tried to stab the ball home but with no avail. But that momentum seemed to have all been in vain when the Saints were awarded a penalty in 63 minutes. A low ball into the box was fired goalwards by Austin, who had been introduced as a substitute a couple moments earlier, and Wan-Bissaka blocked it with his hand. Perhaps slightly rusty having not been on a pitch that long, Austin attempted to fire the spot kick down the middle, however Hennessey made his first Palace penalty save with his legs. He continued to keep his team in the game when Nathan Redmond broke clear inside the box and took aim, but the shot stopper got down low and pushed it away, with Mohamed El-Niossi then striking the top of the crossbar with his follow-up. As the minutes slipped by, McCarthy dealt with shots from range by Kouyaté, Vanano and McArthur as Hodgson's team tried hard to equalise, and then after nodding a header over the top, Benteke had another opportunity to score when Alexander Sorlov nodded the ball into his path and the Belgium headed it downwards, but McCarthy managed to flick it away with his legs as another chance went begging. And that proved crucial as 2 minutes later into stoppage time, just as they had against Liverpool in their last home game, a desperate Palace were caught out on the counter-attack. Matt Targett slipped in Hojbjerg down the left, who had the freedom of Selhurst Park to slide the ball under Hennessey and put an unfair gloss on the scoreline, but ensured that the South Londoners fell to a third league loss in a row. It was an afternoon to forget for Crystal Palace as they lost out 2-0 at home against Southampton on Saturday. The Eagles lost out to goals from Danny Ings and Pierre-Emile Hojbjerg as Roy Hodgson's men struggled without their talisman Wilfried Zaha, who missed out with a thigh injury. But there were plenty of talking points arising from the game from a Palace perspective. Here are some of them. The record without Zaha. Crystal Palace have not won a game in the Premier League without Wilfried Zaha since a 3-2 win against Sunderland back in September 2016. And that trend continued here as the Eagles lost for the 10th time in the Premier League since the beginning of last season without him. Palace boss Roy Hodgson admitted after the game that he nor his players could hide from the fact, and that the Eagles have to try hard to get that monkey off their backs sooner rather than later. Indeed, if they're going to be involved in another relegation battle, that could be crucial. He wasn't the only one missed. At times the atmosphere was very flat inside the stadium. Admittedly, Zaha's absence may have had an impact, which Roy Hodgson admitted himself in his post-match press conference, but it was so quiet that the Southampton fans could be heard singing "Is This a Library?". This is not something you would expect to be heard sung by opposition fans at Selhurst Park, but was reflective of the mood inside the stadium. And several Palace fans have been voicing their opinions of the atmosphere on social media, with many calling for the conclusion to the Homestead Fanatics standoff with the club over tickets. So far this season, the Homestead Fanatics have not been active in that corner of the Homestead Road stand that has become synonymous with Selhurst Park in recent years. And there is no doubt that they, like Wilfried Zaha, were missed against the Saints. Benteke's barren spell continues. Christian Benteke is still searching for his first goal of the season and has now just scored 3 goals in his last 36 Premier League appearances. Prior to that, he had scored 15 goals in his previous 35 appearances. It was not for the want of trying, with Benteke having several good chances against Southampton, but he found a goalkeeper in fine form in Alex McCarthy. However, as Roy Hodgson said after the game, Palace are still waiting for the happy day when Benteke does score and gets the monkey off his back. No home comforts for Palace. Crystal Palace have now played 2 games at home this season and lost both of them, and they are yet to score at Selhurst Park this campaign, losing to both Liverpool and Southampton by the same scoreline, 2-0. This was the first time Palace have failed to score in consecutive home league games during Roy Hodgson's time in charge, while Southampton became the first side other than Liverpool to beat the Eagles in South London since March. The midfield conundrum. Some Crystal Palace fans on social media were questioning why Max Meyer wasn't included in the starting 11, with no Wilfried Zaha for the Eagles. And there were also fans in the stands calling for him to be introduced on the bench, with Palace trailing midway through the second half. Indeed, there were a few boos when the German international was not the first substitute introduced, and a few ironic cheers when he was summoned a few minutes later. But while he showed some flashes of his ability and helped to inject some fresh impetus into Palace's forward play, there was another summer signing who impressed. Kouyaté was positive in his play, having a go from distance shortly after coming on, before bursting forward from deep as Palace went in search for an equaliser. Indeed, both players will have given Hodgson food for thought in midfield, with both Luka Milivojevic and Jeffrey Schlupp ineffective against the Saints. So now I'm going to move on to the player ratings, but before I start, don't forget you can follow us on Twitter and Facebook at Crystal Palace for all the latest Palace news. And also, if you're on Facebook, do feel free to join our Facebook group, which is a really great place to join in with discussions and also share your opinions with other fans. And if you are someone like me who likes going on forums, not only to post your own opinion, but also to read what other fans thought about the game or anything to do with the club, then of course I would say that the Facebook group is the place to go. Now obviously, alongside the Facebook group, we obviously have the Twitter and Facebook pages. Now especially during the transfer window, it's a great place to follow to get all the latest news. And like I said already, whether that's transfer news, whether that's just news about the club in general, or even if it's just player interviews, we do regularly update our Twitter and Facebook pages. So if you are someone who likes to keep up to date with everything about Palace and you want another account to follow for the latest news, then of course do head over there. And of course, like I've said already, the Facebook group, most people will be letting there fairly quickly because we do regulate it. So if you are someone, once again, who wants another place to not only voice your own opinion but also to read others' opinion, and of course go on there as well. And even if it's an opinion about the podcast and you want to get in contact with myself or anyone else on the team, then of course you can do so via the various social media pages. Now of course, if you are listening to the podcast on YouTube, then do feel free to comment below with your player ratings, obviously rating the player performances from 1 to 10, and obviously considering the game we just had at the weekend against Southampton, we're probably going to be seeing a lot of 4s and 5s, maybe even 3s in people's ratings. But like I've said, if you do want to share your opinion, then do feel free to drop below obviously your player ratings, and that's mainly because I can look at it and see realistically how it compares to mine, and how you thought the players performed compares to my sort of standards, how I thought they performed. And even if you don't want to do that, and if you're a Southampton fan, then of course just sort of comment with your overall views of the game. Obviously Palace, from our perspective, it was quite a disappointing game, but from a Southampton fan perspective, it may not have been the best game in terms of football, but actually it was a good win for them in terms of their first of the season. So whether you're a Palace or Southampton fan, And if you obviously don't want to do your player ratings, then do feel free to comment below with your general views of the game, obviously who you thought your man of the match was, and just overall views of, say, some decisions throughout the game. Now obviously the main reason, like I've said already, for you guys to do that is just so I can come back to the video, back to the podcast, and basically read through what you guys thought and compare it to my own opinion. But also any Southampton or any Palace fans who come to the video, they can obviously also read your opinion as well as listen to mine, so they can just get a broader feel for the game as a whole, and basically just give them sort of a more balanced opinion of things. Because personally for me, before I do record the podcast, I do actually have a look on social media, on forums, just to get a general idea of how everyone thought about the game, and just so I can compare that against my own opinion as a whole. Now of course, if you do want to follow any of the social media pages or the Facebook group as I've already mentioned, then of course you can check all links that will be in the description below. But obviously we're going to move on to the player ratings now, starting to go with the goalkeeper Wayne Hennessey. Now personally for me, it was another good performance from him. You know, 4 games he's played so far this season, and it was another fine performance here, and I do think he deserves this 7 I've given him. So personally for me, the main reason I've given him that 7 is mainly because of his first half performance, because going in at half time 0-0, considering the amount of chances Southampton had, that was quite impressive. Now, the main reason I've given him the 7 is because of the amount of good saves he made in that first half. You know, we may necessarily have not been that great, but neither were Southampton, and you could say the scoreline doesn't really reflect the game, because I personally think both teams weren't necessarily going at it 100% throughout the game. But the main reason, like I've said, I've given Hennessey that 7 is because of the amount of saves he's made in that first half, and that obviously does include one terrific save. I can't remember exactly who it was from, but there was one on the edge of the area. I believe it may have been Unuyosi, I think his name is, or Eliosi, for Southampton. He's absolutely rifled it from the edge of the area. It may not have even been him, but whoever it was, rifled it from that, you know, edge of the area, and obviously Hennessey had to make a save. So once I said, you know, I've said this quite a lot last season and obviously the beginning of this season, the thing that Hennessey's improved on is just making the simple saves, and that's exactly what he done in the first half. Because even though Southampton had more chances than Palace, whenever they did have chances, they obviously didn't finish them off in that first half, purely because obviously someone like Hennessey was just making himself big and making all the saves. And to be honest, even though Palace didn't have that many chances, the same could be said for Alex McCarthy on the other end, because he also had a very good game. Now to be honest, obviously 2 minutes into that second half, obviously we concede the first goal. Obviously a great ball in from, I think it was the right hand side, yeah, well, Southampton's right hand side. Literally a defence cutting pass. It looked like it was going to go to the left hand side, and it was a nice switch of play, but instead it goes right to goes right to Danny Ings, who's literally centre of goal, and he literally just rifles it outside of the boot past Hennessey. And to be honest, I don't really think we can blame Hennessey too much for that goal, purely based on the fact that he was just exposed for his defence. You know, you've got Kelly, who was sort of tracking back and obviously didn't see Ings on his shoulder, and of course you've got Mamadou Sakho as well, who I thought was overall one of the better defenders in the game, but still he was ball watching and obviously made it pretty easy for Ings to get in behind and score. So for me personally, I know people would say Hennessey probably deserves an 8 given his performance and given the high amount of saves and catches he made throughout the game, but for me, because obviously he conceded the 2 goals, albeit not his fault, that's why I've given him that. Now the main reason Hennessey had a fantastic performance is the fact that he saved the penalty. Now obviously when I heard, or obviously if you're at the stand, when you saw it happen, you thought a penalty. Hennessey's never saved the penalty and he's always gone the opposite way. I basically was pretty worried. I thought 2-0 down midway through the second half, there's no way we're going to get back into it. Now obviously because Hennessey hasn't been that great at saving penalties, I had no hope. But when I saw him, you know, he went the wrong way in the fact that he dived to his right instead of staying central. But the fact that he's so tall and the fact that he was able to get his legs behind the ball and sort of whip it out so that the Palace defenders could clear it, that was the thing that was most impressive for me. Because if you're going to dive to the left or the right as a goalkeeper, you want to still make sure that if it does go down the middle, which some players do that, you want to make sure that you've still got a chance of doing that. And that's exactly what Hennessey did. He made himself big, he stretched his legs out and was able to chip the clear the ball away. So for me, obviously it was a silly penalty to give away, but obviously good to see Hennessey saving it. And obviously, like I've said, the other goal, I can't really fault him for that other goal. You know, that was on the counter-attack. Some could say Hennessey should have done better in the fact that he should have came out earlier or stayed on his line. So rather than doing sort of something in the middle, he should have either been very sort of to the point, ran and got the ball straight away, or stayed in his line and tried to save it there. So I think maybe that's what he could have done better with. But personally for me, no chance with the goals. And you know, last weekend I talked quite briefly about the fact that he was making himself big and catching crosses. That's exactly what he done here again. And obviously I think the word you could use was faultless, because I personally don't think the goals were his fault. and the fact that he made all of these good saves in that first half, the fact that he was making good catches throughout the game, and obviously that one terrific save in that first half, I do think he does deserve that 7. But overall, Wayne Hennessey, another improving performance from him, and certainly if you're looking at sort of our top 3 players this season, so far in the 4 games we've played, excluding the Cup, you've got to look at Wayne Hennessey, someone like Aaron Wan-Bissaka, and obviously probably someone like Wilfried Zaha. Even though he's not being that great, he's obviously got the most goals for Palace. So you're looking at sort of Hennessey, Wan-Bissaka, and maybe let's say someone like James Tompkins. So let's say that's the top 4 players so far this season. Hennessey last season would have been nowhere near sort of the best players of a certain part of the season, but actually this season he started it very well, and long may it continue, because like I've said already, and I say this every week now, which is a great thing, end of last season his form was absolutely fantastic. Coming into this season his form's been good as well, so long may that continue. But Wayne Hennessey here, a 7 for him. Some could argue does deserve an 8, but because he conceded the 2 goals, albeit not his 4, I think a 7 is a fair result. So we're now going to move on to the defence, starting at right back with Aaron Wan-Bissaka. Obviously coming back into the side after his suspension, he played midweek, done very, very well there, and once again in the Premier League, I think this is his 11th appearance now, once again put an outstanding performance in, and that's the reason I've given him a 7. Now, to be honest, once again, you know, I've talked about him being the best player, but considering his age, once again, again and again, he puts in these good performances, which just goes to show that actually how much he's developed and how mature he is as a player, in the fact that he can continue to put in high standards of performances like this, even though he's so young and so inexperienced. Now, once again, he was one of Palace's best players, and you know, this was not only going forward, or not only defensively, but going forward as well. Now, at the beginning of the season, so the first sort of 2 games or so, I said that defensively he was absolutely outstanding, probably a 9 out of 10. But going forward, that's what let him down. You know, when he got into that final third, he sort of, most of the time he overhit crosses to go for goal kicks, or he hit it out for a throw on the other side, or he just didn't even cross and he just passed it to the winger or another midfielder who was in the area. But the thing that's improved in his last 2 games, so obviously in the Cup and obviously the game here against Southampton at the weekend, that's what I saw that improve with his game. The fact that he was not only being very solid defensively, you know, making loads of tackles and, you know, doing what he does really, really well defensively, but the fact that he got forward down that right hand side and not only was sort of dribbling to the byline and putting crosses in, but also he was dribbling inside the box as well and trying to create chances of his own inside the box. And that's something that's really great to see. You know, obviously you'd expect fullbacks to run down their flank and obviously cross balls in, but the fact that Wan-Bissaka not only was crossing the balls in, which were pretty accurate, the fact that he was also using his pace and delivery and, you know, to get inside and dribble inside the Southampton defence, and the fact that he caused them so many problems, that was of course great to see as well. Now, to be honest, in that first half, you know, I talked about Hennessey making loads of saves, but by far Aaron Wan-Bissaka was the best player in that first half. You know, whether it would be his slide tackling, whether it be his, you know, his pace on that right hand flank, or whether it be his deliveries from out wide, whatever it was in that first half, it was absolutely outstanding. And when you consider it was sort of quite a lacklustre performance in that first half especially, you can understand, you know, you can understand why he was one of our better players on the day. But as I've said already, you know, I criticised him at the beginning of the season, despite his good performances, because of his lack of sort of final product, his final end product in the sort of the final third. But he seems to have improved that drastically in the last 2 games, and long may it continue, because not only is he proving to us a valuable defensive asset in the fact that he can make loads of slide tackles, but he's now showing us actually, because he used to be a winger, and I think he used to be a striker at one point as well, he's now starting to show, because of his pace and because of his delivery, how much of a good offensive threat he was. Now, of course, his second half was slightly, I wouldn't say slightly worse, it was just slightly sort of under par the high standards he set in that first half, and that was mainly because he obviously got booked for giving away the penalty for a handball. Obviously, you know, a great chance for Charlie Austin to put it into the bottom corner, kill the game dead at 2-0. But obviously Wan-Bissaka stuck his hand out, got booked for it rightly enough, and of course, you know, we know what happened next. You know, Hennessey goes on to save the penalty. But that just goes to show that sometimes a little bit of a lapse in concentration, or in his case just a lack of experience, just meant that he left his arm trailing there and gave away the penalty. Can't really disagree with that too much, because, you know, it was obviously a deliberate handball and rightly did deserve the penalty. But like I've said already, it was obviously great for us not to get punished for that, in the fact that Hennessey made a fantastic save with his legs, you know, to save the penalty. Now, I think the word I would use to describe his second half performance when you compare it to the first half is sort of more subdued, in the fact that he was very, very impactful. Let's say he made so much impact in that first half, performed really, really well, and probably looking at that first half, you probably could have given him an 8 out of 10. But just the fact that his second half is a bit more subdued, not necessarily the same sort of intensity as that first half performance, that's the main reason I've given him a 7 as opposed to an 8, because I think that his inexperience showed. The fact that when under pressure by a team not necessarily playing that great a football as we were as well, so both teams not really playing that great football, and because it was quite scrappy at times, his sort of inexperience showed, and that just sort of seemed to reflect his second half play, and the fact that he wasn't necessarily as composed going forward as he was in the other half. And obviously on the counter-attack, you know, where we conceded our final goal in, I think it was the 92nd minute, obviously once again inexperience showed there, in the fact that not enough players stayed back, and you would expect him to be one of them players. None of them stayed back and were able to sort of catch the midfielder quick enough to obviously stop him scoring the goal. So once again here, Aaron Wan-Bissaka on his 11th appearance for the club. Once again another good performance from him, you know, both defensively and offensively, and certainly he probably could have got an 8 for his first half performance, but obviously his second half was a bit more subdued, obviously gave away the penalty, and obviously his general sort of inexperience did show. But nevertheless, if you sort of take away that penalty he gave away, you say overall a very good performance, and certainly does deserve the 7 I've given him. So obviously now we're going to move on to the centre of the fence, obviously starting with Martin Kelly. Now personally for me, I'm going to give him a 5 for his performance. You know, I talked about midweek that he was probably one of our most better players, you know, in the cup, mainly because of his experience, and certainly here again, you know, I've given him a 5, mainly because he wasn't terrible in the game, which some people thought he was. I just think he wasn't sort of up to the standards that he's set in the past sort of season or so when he's played alongside Mamadou Sakho. But to be honest, much like quite a lot of the team, although the first half wasn't great, I don't think he done too much wrong in that first half. So for people criticising him for conceding the 2 goals, yes, obviously put the 2 goals aside, actually I thought his performance, especially in that first half, was relatively good. Now of course, you know, I talked about the opening goal and the fact that I didn't blame Hennessey. You've got to give, you know, you've got to blame sort of Kelly and Sakho for ball watching and just reacting a bit too slowly. You know, the ball over the top, obviously it looked like it was going to go out to that left hand side, but obviously you must have sort of put not too much pace on the cross, so instead of it going out wide, it went down the middle. And obviously Ings scored the goal. It was a great finish in terms of one touch outside of the boot past Hennessey, but obviously like I've said already, Martin Kelly, rather than ball watching, he should have just been there and just either headed it clear or just got in the way of Ings, so he couldn't score that. And the same could be said for Mamadou Sakho, who I'm going to go on to talk about in a minute. But I think the word I would use to describe Kelly's performance is basically just average. You know, I don't think he was great. I don't necessarily think, other than the goals, he was terrible in the game. So you've got to give him his due in the fact that for the majority of the game, like I've said, other than the goals, the majority of the game I thought he was relatively good. And I think another word I probably could use to describe his performance was aggressive, because although he was pretty average in his overall play, and the fact that he couldn't really play the ball out of the back did seem to sort of hurt us. But other than that, I did think he was aggressive. You know, he made himself quite big and made it relatively difficult for Ings, and I think it was Shane Long who started the game. So obviously, you know, you've got 2 good players there, and you made it quite difficult for them in the beginning. But obviously, as the game wore on and we conceded the first and we conceded the second, it did just sort of show a bit of sort of a weakness, let's say, at the back, and sort of a lack of concentration in the fact that they reacted too slowly for one of the goals, and obviously the other goal they were sort of just underestimating the ability that Southampton had on the counter-attack. But my final point really I wanted to touch on about Martin Kelly, because overall there's not too much to talk about his performance. It's just the fact that he provides excellent cover. Now, he may not be the like-for-like replacement we would want for someone like James Tompkins, or if Tompkins isn't injured and Sakho's injured, it's not necessarily a like-for-like replacement, but I think Kelly does bring sort of us excellent cover, because he may not be the best defender in the world, but he's a very competent defender. He can do a shift, and as shown in this performance here, where he may not have been the best, but he's still done a job, and he's still obviously it's not great losing the game 2-0, but the fact that, you know, the fact that we weren't playing that great, and the fact that we came away only conceding 2 goals, given how badly we performed, you've got to give a bit of credit to the defence, because realistically, if your midfield is being overrun and they're not playing well, there's a lot more pressure on you as a defence. And obviously when there's a lot more pressure on you as a defence, sort of little errors like reacting too slowly to the ball over the top sort of do creep into your game. So you can understand him having sort of more subdued game, in the fact that, you know, because the sort of overall the whole team weren't playing that good. But obviously we do expect a little bit higher standards from Kelly, because he's shown how good he can play, not only when he's come in this season, but also last season towards the end when he was playing with Sakho and Tompkins. I did think he did show his quality there. But Martin Kelly here, not the best performance, not the worst, a 5 for him. So now I'm going to move on to the second central defender in our back four, and that was of course Mamadou Sakho. Now, I'm going to give him a 6 for his overall performance because, as I said with Kelly, I don't think he was necessarily terrible in the game, but certainly out of our back four, alongside Wan-Bissaka, he was probably one of our best defenders on the day. Now, to be honest, I talk about players who it takes them quite a lot of time to get into the game. They start the game quite slowly, and that was exactly the case here for Mamadou Sakho. Shane Long, we know that he, before playing us back in February, I think it was, he obviously went on a very long barren spell, hadn't scored loads of goals. But of course, Palace, we like breaking records, and of course he scored that goal against us. Now, in the past, we've sort of had this thing where certain players do like to score against us, and certainly that was the case with Shane Long. But obviously Mamadou Sakho, obviously as he does, he's a bit of a maverick. He gave the ball away to Shane Long just in sort of the game's openings, and of course that's not really that great, in the fact that you give your ball back to, you're trying to play it back to your goalkeeper, and of course you almost give it to the opposition. So in that respect, you could say actually Mamadou Sakho giving away a quite sort of really easy chance to the opposition right early on in the game is obviously quite dangerous. But the fact that he made up for it moments later, where obviously Shane Long got into the area, and the fact that he made a super block to deny him from about 8 yards out, so it was obviously quite difficult from that range to get down low before the shot's been put away. So the fact that he made up for the fact that he gave the ball away to Shane Long when trying to pass the ball back to Hennessey, the fact that he made up with that super block is mainly the reason why I've given him a 6 as opposed to a 5. It's just the fact that he made himself big when it did matter the most, and of course, thankfully we didn't get punished for the other one, but the fact that he made up for it obviously is great as well. Now, as obviously I said with Martin Kelly, I don't necessarily think he was terrible, but he was still aggressive in his play. And for the 2 goals we conceded, of course you've got to blame the defence. And although Mamadou Sakho wasn't great, I think he was solid enough throughout the game. And that's what I said with Martin Kelly, is the fact that if you're not going to play a decent game and the whole team's really sort of having a lacklustre performance, I'd rather a player just put in an average performance and just get through the game, not necessarily do anything too bad, other than obviously that back pass to Hennessey. If you've got a player who can do that, I'd much rather that, as opposed to seeing a player who, when the whole team doesn't play well, it seems to affect them as well. So in that respect, obviously it's great to see Sakho obviously put in a fairly solid performance, but obviously it's a little bit disappointing in the fact that for the first goal we conceded, obviously him and Martin Kelly didn't see the run of Ings, and obviously they didn't get in the way of it, and the fact you could argue that maybe they should have been facing the ball and maybe should have headed it clear. And of course for the second goal as well, we conceded on the counter-attack. It's the last few minutes of the game. Rather than trying to put all your eggs in one basket and try and get a late header, I'd much rather us just have players on the edge of the area and a few more back in defence, so that we've obviously, if we do get countered, we can obviously make sure we can stop that counter. And obviously you've got to get that balance right. You've got to have the balance between players who stay back, which in our case I think it was Cheku Kouyaté, and you've got to get balance between who is in the box. So if you're in the last minute of the game, you've got to, if you're going to lose the game, you've got to conserve your goal difference. So rather than putting all of your defenders in the box, I'd much rather us have at least one centre back and one at least full back and maybe one midfielder staying back. And obviously you can put the rest of the players in the box, but at least that way, if you do get countered, you've got a few more players in the box. And ultimately, like we did against Liverpool, and obviously like we did against Southampton at the weekend, we put too many players in the box, albeit it was a very good counter-attack in terms of the switch of play, but nevertheless we obviously got ripped open quite easily towards the end of the game. And to be honest, if it was a 1-0, I would have said, yeah, fair enough. I think Southampton were the better team, but we both played pretty bad. But obviously 2-0, given the chances we had in the game as well, and given sort of the dominance we had after we brought our 3 substitutes on, you could argue that actually maybe it's not necessarily a fair reflection on the game as a whole. But if you're looking at the game, especially that sort of first half and the first sort of 20 minutes or so of that second half, you would obviously got to say that Southampton were quite clearly the better side. But if you listen to sort of what Mark Hughes said after the game, and the fact that, oh yeah, it was a good win, obviously our first of the season, and obviously we were the better team. Yes, that's necessarily true, but I don't think he made it out as if they dominated the whole game, where actually, if you look at it, yes, they may have dominated sort of the second half of that first period, but actually the first half was sort of 50-50, quite drab, quite boring, and obviously sort of 70 minutes onwards, Palace were the better side. So to say your team dominated for the whole game, not necessarily true, but certainly you've got to give Southampton credit, because although they didn't play great football, they still dominated for large periods, but not all of the game as a whole. But Mamadou Sakho here, playing in the centre of defence, wasn't necessarily a best game from him. Probably could have done better with the first goal, and certainly probably shouldn't have risked going into the box for the corner for the second. But overall, not a terrible performance, and I do think he does deserve the 6. But if you are someone who does disagree and maybe thinks he does deserve a 5, then of course, obviously get in contact with us or comment it below in the YouTube comments. So I'm now going to move on to our final player of our back four, and that is of course the left back Patrick Van Aanholt. Now, much like what I've said with Kelly, it was a sort of a pretty lacklustre performance from him, and certainly that sort of was the general theme across the whole team. Now I'm going to give him a 5 for his performance, because when you consider he's normally one of the players who gets Palace going, one of our biggest attacking threats, when you consider things didn't quite fall for him in this game, and the fact that he weren't necessarily that great offensively in this game, you can understand why I've given him a 5. Now, I've got to stress, like I said with Kelly, I think even though he was sort of classy in the game, that in the fact that he didn't play terribly, but he just wasn't that effective, even though that was the case, you've got to give him a bit of credit, and that's the reason why I haven't given him a 4 like some people have. I've just given him a 5, benefit of the doubt. Yes, it was a poor game by his standards, but obviously his standards are getting into the box, you know, running up and down that flank, which realistically we didn't quite see enough of in this game. Now, to be honest, like I say every week, he's obviously one of our biggest threats, and he's the one who normally makes it happen. But the fact that Southampton was so solid and so compact, both defensively and obviously in midfield as well, playing more offensively, because of that, for the majority of the game, Palace was sort of camped, well, especially in that first half, we were camped in our own half. Now, as a result of that, it obviously meant that someone like Van Aanholt, who plays his game majority sort of in a more offensive role, because we were camped in our own half, he didn't really get that sort of ability and that freedom to go on the outside, do overlaps and things like that, and because of that, it ultimately meant that sort of our play did I don't know how to describe it really, but our sort of play, because he couldn't get forward, suffered. There you go, that's the word I was trying to use. But the fact that he couldn't get us forward as much as he would have liked, and obviously the fact that he weren't playing with Wilfried Zaha on that wing, because obviously that's a massive loss for Palace. The fact that he obviously weren't playing with sort of that trio of Jeffrey Slupp and Zaha as well on that flank, it obviously, that as well as the fact that we were camped in our own half, seemed to have quite a big impact on his game. But like I said already, you know, I personally would prefer, if we're going to have a bad performance collectively as a team, I'd rather certain players just put in average performances, as opposed to sort of everyone just sort of being bad. And that's exactly the case with Van Aanholt here, because I don't think necessarily defensively he was at fault. You know, the second goal in particular, he couldn't really do too much about that, because he's one of these players who's sort of on the edge of the court, or by the corner flag, so he can provide sort of that 1-2 crossing opportunity from that corner. And obviously, because of that, it meant there was no real chance he could get down there. And obviously, because he's the left back, he's playing on the left hand side, because the sort of counter-attack primarily came down Palace's right hand flank, there wasn't really too much he can do there. So defensively, he weren't really at fault for either goals. You could argue, because the ball came in for the first goal from his side, you could argue he should have done better. But personally for me, I'm not really going to put some sort of too much blame on it overall. But if I have to pick up one good thing from his performance, and maybe possibly a reason I've given him a 5 as opposed to a 4, it's just the fact that even though we were camped in our own half, there were still a few times where he made some lovely runs. But much like has been sort of the theme of the team in the last sort of few games or so, it's just sort of that dodgy end product. And unlike last season, where whenever he got the ball inside the box, he'd either make a perfect cross or obviously score, and obviously that's why he was such a great attacking threat last season. Unlike that last season, where whenever he was in the box, whenever he had a chance, more than likely 9 times out of 10 he finished it. Unlike that, he had lovely runs, which is what he had last season, but he just didn't have that end product. And that was the thing that was more disappointing for me, because in a game where it's quite drab, when you do get a chance, you obviously need to take it and make sure that you're not punished by the other team. And, you know, Van Aanholt, much like someone like Benteke in this game here, probably you could argue is one of these players who's probably guilty of not taking his chances like he should have, because if he had taken them, ultimately maybe we would have drawn the game, or maybe if the goals had happened in the first half or the beginning of the second half, maybe there could have been a different story, and maybe Palace could have gone on to win the game. And like I've said, football is not just a game about kicking the ball across the pitch, it's all about game-changing moments. And certainly for me, I do think when players miss chances, that can change sort of the whole course of the game. So personally for me, sort of that dodgy end product did seem to sort of change the game in Southampton's favour, mainly because it just showed that we haven't really got that threat going forward like we have done. But like I've said, Van Aanholt is normally a threat, but obviously disappointingly for me personally, obviously not so much in this game here. But overall, I think I'm going to give him that 5 for his performance. You know, he was pretty classy in the fact that he wasn't terrible, but once again, like I've said with someone like Martin Kelly, I think the best word to use is sort of average for his overall performance, and I certainly don't think he deserves anything less than a 5, but certainly I do think a 5 is sort of a fair reflection of his game, given the fact that he's one of the players who normally gets things going for Palace, but he basically didn't do that in this game here at the weekend. So I'm going to move on now to the midfield, and I'm going to start with the captain, Luka Milivojevic. Now, one of the recurring themes I've said in this podcast so far is the fact that the team overall had a pretty disappointing sort of lacklustre performance, and certainly I've already talked about certain players who actually I thought were pretty average, weren't necessarily at fault for the bad performance, whereas Luka Milivojevic, on the other hand, considering he's the captain, he was one of the more disappointing players on the pitch, and certainly that's the reason that I've given him a 4. Now, of course, I've talked quite a lot this season, and I talked especially last week about the reasons why it could be. But I think this season, the start of this season, whatever it's been, obviously for some reason, Luka Milivojevic hasn't necessarily been playing to the best of his ability in the middle of the park. Now, of course, you know, in this game here, he's the captain. Obviously, he's got to try and lead the team. But obviously, when you have a bad performance, one of the first players you look to is the captain, as to whether maybe he weren't necessarily commanding the team enough, whether he was sort of not organising them enough. Whatever it was in this game, I don't necessarily think it's fair to pinpoint it exactly on him, because I think Hodgson has to bear quite a lot of the blame. But actually, sometimes you've got to look at the captain with bad performances and actually go, maybe he should have sort of rallied the troops and sort of done better in that respect. But in terms of why I've given him a 4 for his performance, I think, obviously I've said already, the whole of this season, not this game, but this game as well, I think he was not at his best. So whether that's because he's come back from the World Cup, so he's still sort of fatigued from that, and maybe it's sort of because he missed a bit of pre-season, he's still getting 100% up to scratch, or whether it's just because, like someone like Benteke, he's just going sort of through a barren spell, going through a rough patch, and maybe his form will come back eventually. Whatever it is, he's obviously not performing to the high standards he set, not only with Palace last season, but of course in the summer when he was playing for Serbia. Now, just to point out a few things about his performance which were bad. Quite a number of stray passes, so passes where he's sort of looking to do the right thing in terms of spraying it out wide or spraying it long, but most of them were quite stray, either going out obviously for throw-ins, or obviously getting intercepted quite easily by the opposition. Now, this is something we didn't see last season, because quite often, especially towards the end of last season, his passing was fantastic. So obviously that's a bit disappointing, the fact that he's given away lots of passes. And obviously last week I criticised him for not making a foul, which obviously meant that Watford went up the other end of the pitch and scored. And obviously this weekend here against Southampton, he done the complete opposite, where he kept making too many fouls, most of them quite unnecessary. And of course that sort of breaks up the play, and obviously you've got to be very cautious, because you keep making these fouls, you're obviously going to be in the eyes of the referee. So he's gone from one extreme last week where he didn't make a tackle, which obviously resulted in us conceding a goal, which was obviously disappointing, whereas this week he's gone to the other end and he's making too many fouls, which overall is really not really that great. Now, many people obviously talk about the fact that he almost scored an own goal. Obviously Mohamed El Nursi's put in a free kick into the area. I think it was either Austin, maybe Shane Long, or maybe it was Danny Ings. I can't remember which of the strikers that were on the pitch at the time, but they've obviously come closest to us. And obviously Luka, yes, it looks like he's almost scoring an own goal, but if he hadn't have made that header from that free kick, you know, Ings or whoever it was would have had a free header and they probably would have hit it in top corner. So whilst people will probably criticise him in the fact that Hennessey had to make a save because he made a dodgy back pass with his head, actually if you look at it, you know, from different angles, if he hadn't have made that interception and put it out for a corner with Hennessey making the save, Ings probably would have got on the end of the header and probably it would have gone in. So realistically, you've got to look at that and go, actually, yes, it's bad, and that's one of the reasons he had a bad performance, in the fact that he, you know, put a head like that was a header in that was quite dangerous. But actually, if you look at it another perspective, actually it was quite important he done that because it stopped the opposition from getting the ball. But whatever your viewpoint of it, is obviously quite dangerous defending and not necessarily what you want to be seeing, because sometimes the goalkeeper won't see that and it will go in. So obviously we've got to be grateful that Hennessey was there to make a save. But in terms of that was just another, along with his passing and his fouls, that sort of header put back to Hennessey was obviously quite disappointing as well. And to be honest, I've talked quite a lot in terms of different words to describe different players' performances, but I think the word to describe Luka's performance is just woeful. You know, at the moment his pace seems to be an issue. Whenever he's under pressure from the opposition, he seems to be putting these stray passes in, and of course, you know, when he's sort of challenged by the opposition, he's obviously committing these unnecessary fouls. So everything about his gameplay, which was so good last season, so good during the World Cup, we haven't seen yet at Palace, and that's why ultimately he's given the 4, because it was another disappointing performance from him. But I don't really want to dwell too much on his performance, because I've talked quite a lot already this season as to why his performances may be subpar. But like I said already, quite a disappointing performance from the captain, considering he's meant to be the man marshalling his team. But overall, I do think a 4 is a fair result, and I'm certainly sure that given the fact that he gave away so many passes and committed so many fouls, I'm sure I won't see any reason why people wouldn't give him a 3, maybe even a 2, considering how poor his performance was. But now move on to his midfield partner, and that was of course James McArthur. Now personally for me, I think he had a good performance, and this was another one that came up for quite a lot of debate on Twitter. But personally for me, I'm going to give him a 7 for his overall performance. Now the main reason for that is because I thought he was one of Palace's best players, and much like what I talked about with Wan-Bissaka, not only defensively was McArthur good in terms of playing in front of the back four alongside Luka, but I thought offensively he was very good as well. Now, what I said last week in the fact that McArthur played a very sort of clear box-to-box role, it was very obvious to see that that was the position he was playing in. And once again, even though he may not have been as great as he was last weekend, he's still done that relatively successfully, considering the overall team performance was quite under par. Now, one of the main reasons I quite liked him offensively is because, personally for me, I don't think his partnership with Luka really works. So when he gets the chance to go forward and has a little bit more freedom in that role, not having to play so deep alongside Luka, it seemed to sort of makes him able to express himself, and certainly he proves how much of a threat he is. Now, one of the reasons he was a threat in this game is that even though he was quiet for some parts, when the ball did pop to him, he was one of sort of the architects of most of Palace's attacks. Now, obviously we went 1-0 down quite early on in the second half, and I think it was less than 5 minutes later, we've gone up the other end of the pitch. A chance has come to McArthur on the edge of the area, and he's curled it right going into the top corner from just outside the box, and of course the shot came over the bar with the keeper beaten. So not only, like I've said, McArthur was doing his work defensively, getting back and helping Luka, although that partnership didn't really look that great. Actually going forward, I thought he was one of Palace's biggest threats, and I've talked about it already with a few players like Van Aanholt in particular. When that chance came to McArthur, rather than him just faffing about looking for a pass and just hesitating, McArthur took that chance, and unluckily for him it came off the bar, which just goes to show that actually if you take your chances and you're actually good at finishing, eventually they're going to go in, because you have chances like that. If you don't take the chance, you're not going to know what's going to happen. So McArthur took the chance, and of course he was quite unlucky for it to come off the bar. Now, one of the things I talked about quite a lot last season in terms of his style of play was just his good energy. And once again here against Southampton, even though Southampton were playing much better than us, and you could say dominating for the first half and the first bit of the second half, because even though they were dominating, I still think McArthur showed a good amount of energy, and certainly was one of Palace's more positive players in the game, in the fact that he was trying to use this energy to get on the front foot and obviously help Palace to get back in the game. Now, of course, as I've already mentioned, he obviously had that shot from distance, which obviously came off the bar, but also there are a number of other opportunities where actually you'd look at McArthur and go, he's the guy who could have made the difference for Palace if obviously his chance had gone in rather than hitting the bar. And of course, if other players were able to finish, there was a goal mouth scramble in the second half, if a player had been able to finish one of them chances, as opposed to basically all of the Southampton backline just getting behind and getting in front of the goal, if someone had been able just to stab it home between all the players, then maybe it would have been a different story. But the final point really for me, just to touch on McArthur, and this is just sort of in general, it's just that he's sort of a manager's dream for the squad, because not only is he very consistent in terms of he always puts in 7s out of 10s every week, but also it's just his energy again, and this sort of performance just really epitomises how he is as a player, in the fact that even when the team has a bad game, he still puts in 110% effort, and of course that energy sort of helps us to sort of get into the game. And certainly when the substitutes came on, likes of Kouyaté, Meyer and Alexander Sorloth, I did think that alongside McArthur they did seem to do a great job there, and it does beg the question as to whether when do these players start? You've got likes of Luka and Slup who are not necessarily playing that well this season, so maybe someone like Kouyaté and Meyer can come in, and considering they looked quite good in their partnership in the sort of second half alongside McArthur, maybe that could be an option for us going forward, in the fact that we've got the sort of box-to-box nature of McCarthy, we've then got the defensive, sort of a defensive creative player in Meyer, and of course we've got a very energetic player in Cheikhou Kouyaté. So maybe as a midfield 3 that could work, but I still think we've still got the best to see from Luka, and I think he might be going through a bad patch. But certainly for me, having seen how good that basically the options off the bench were when they came on and formed a partnership with McArthur, it's obviously got to give Roy Hodgson food for thought, because certainly they did look quite good together. But overall, James McArthur, one of Palace's better players on the day, and certainly up there for the man of the match. Basically because the whole team sort of had a lacklustre performance, but he was one of the players who stood out for me in the fact that even though the team were playing bad, he was still putting in 110% effort. So now I'm going to move on now to the left wing, obviously starting with Jeffrey Schlupp. I am going to give him a 4 for his performance, and you know, this was another player who you could probably argue he should get a 3 overall, but personally for me, an opinion is my opinion, and I do think a 4 is a sort of fair reflection of his game. Now, to be honest, I've talked about it already, but I use words to describe players' performances, and I think anonymous is the best word to describe Jeffrey Schlupp, because even though we were pretty bad in the game, he was one of these players who you can't actually look back at the game and said he actually done anything, because he neither done anything good, he neither done anything bad, and that really, I think anonymous really just epitomises his performances, not only this game, but his performances overall in the season as a whole. Now, to be honest, because we were playing quite a narrow midfield, it obviously meant that he was playing sort of in the centre for quite a lot of the time, and actually on a few occasions when he did get into good positions, he sort of chose the wrong option, and that once again just goes to show that he was quite anonymous in the fact that even when he had a chance, he still didn't make the right option, which obviously meant that he couldn't really stamp his authority on the game. Now, to be honest, obviously a few people have said this on Twitter, and I've read it on a few forums, is the fact that is he fast anymore? Now, obviously we saw against Fulham that he's got pace to run down that left-hand flank, and personally for me, I was very happy for him to start, you know, the next game against Liverpool. He was a bit disappointing there, very disappointing against Southampton. Did alright in the cup against it was against Swansea, and obviously once again here in the Premier League against Southampton, he was quite poor again. So people are raising the question whether is he rapid anymore, because we brought him to the club. He was a very fast-paced left back. Obviously, he can play as a left winger or can play up front, and certainly, you know, beginning of the season we saw that, and last season we saw it. But in this game here, I don't know whether it's just because we were camped in our own half and because Southampton were defending quite deep, but he didn't seem to look that quite fast anymore. And actually, if you'd seen him play against Southampton, you wouldn't have thought he was a rapid player, because really, whenever he got the ball, like I've said already, because he was so anonymous, whenever he had the chance, he sort of made the wrong option and didn't really have that chance to make a real impact on the game. But like I've said already, he probably is fast, and I'm probably sort of just really over-exaggerating in the fact that his performance was bad, so I'm just going to say he's not fast anymore. But I do think it was quite obvious in this game that actually, if you look at it from sort of a neutral perspective, you would think actually he's a really slow player, slows down Palace's attacks, whereas actually, if he did get the chance and if he did make the right options and used his pace to his advantage, because obviously if you've got pace, that's a real asset. If he had actually used that, then maybe we would have seen a better game for him. But the final point really I want to finish on is the fact that he must be dropped for the next game. You know, we've got an international break, and hopefully over that, obviously the whole team can improve and regroup and get our structure back. But also the main thing for me is actually Roy Hodgson picks his best side. You know, you've got likes of Meyer now, Kouyaté, who've come off the bench and shown their quality. You've also got someone who, like Alexander Sorloth, who you could argue is better than Christian Benteke. So you've got 3 players there who came off the bench against Southampton and proved to be better and actually made more impact in sort of half an hour they had on the field. Well, yeah, probably half an hour or so, if it's obviously on average, than most of the other players on the pitch had for the whole game. So maybe over this international break, I think it's fair for Hodgson to change up his team. And certainly for me, I think Jeffrey Schlupp's one of these players who, he hasn't been absolutely terrible, he's just been ineffective and been anonymous in games. So personally for me, I do think it's fair for him to be dropped, and I think that someone like Meyer, Kouyaté should come into the side, and even though Schlupp will be dropped, I still think he'd be a good option off the bench if we need a bit more pace or we need a bit of cover defensively. I think he'd be a good option like that, but I just think at the minute, because his confidence doesn't seem to be that great and he's not performing that well, I do think that Hodgson really has to drop him for the next game. But Jeffrey Schlupp here, do comment below with your thoughts, you know, whether you would have given him a 3 or a 4. But personally for me, pretty anonymous in this game, although I must say, and to his credit, I don't think he done anything necessarily really bad and really terrible. I just think he wasn't really as effective as he could have been given the pace and sort of the attributes he does have. So I'm going to move on now to the other side, obviously with the right winger Andros Townsend, and much like what I said with the whole team, a pretty average performance from him, and I do think the 5 is the best way to describe his performance. Now obviously I've used words to describe other players, but I'm just going to use a phrase, and it's just quite simply not his best, because I've talked about quite a lot, you know, last season, in the fact that Andros Townsend is one of our most consistent performers, you know, always puts in sort of 6, 7 out of 10 performances, and overall, even though he might not get loads of goals, his work ethic and sort of his workload is very good. Now, obviously, this season he's been pretty good. Obviously, he hasn't got any goals or assists, but I think he's been very effective in terms of using his pace to his advantage and just helping Palace on the attack. Now, here against Southampton, once again, probably because we were camped in our own half and because Southampton defended quite deep and quite tight, basically meant that most of our attacking players didn't really get the freedom and weren't really playing that well. But to be honest, I personally weren't quite pleased to see him go off because loads of people in the stadium were booing. Personally, for me, I'm not getting involved in that. But I thought it was quite a strange substitute at the time, considering Jeffrey Slupp on the other wing was probably having a worse game than Townsend, yet Townsend was the man to come off. Now, personally for me, at the time, I thought it was a really bad substitute. You know, we were chasing the game. Why are we taking off the better of our two attacking wingers and putting on a defensive midfielder? But actually, it seemed to work really well, and obviously Jeffrey Slupp eventually came off, because the reason it worked really well bringing Townsend off is that we brought in a new midfielder, obviously gave us a bit more dominance in the centre of the park, which is what we were missing throughout the game. And obviously because of his physical presence and the fact that he could drive with the ball from deep, it obviously meant that Kouyaté made a slightly more difference to the game, and obviously had more impact than Townsend, basically because their fullbacks from Southampton were defending so well, so the way we were going to get through and create chances was down the middle. So bringing in an extra man in midfield, then bringing on Meyer afterwards, that's all just gave us a little bit more push and a bit more energy down the middle, and it certainly made a difference. And personally for me, I wouldn't have taken Townsend off first, I probably would have taken off Slupp, but I still do understand why you took him off, because he was pretty ineffective and the other players certainly brought more energy to the game. But to be honest, I think, like I've said already, very average performance from him, and it really just summed up the whole of our midfield. Obviously playing 4-4-2, we play with that sort of quite narrow 4 in midfield, and actually, you know, it was quite a disappointing performance from him, and considering he's normally one of these players who's very consistent, it just goes to show once in a while you have a bad game, and, you know, quite understandably this was one of his there, and I can understand why he had an off game. It's because overall as a team the tactics seemed wrong and the approach to the game seemed wrong, so I can understand him having a bad game, but of course it was disappointing to see him perform as he did. But unlike Slupp on the other wing, I think Townsend needs to stay in the side, because given confidence and given a system that's right for him, and obviously given players around him who are playing well, I think he could be a very crucial player for us going forth this season. So now we're going to move on to the first of our two strikers up front in our 4-4-2 formation, and that is of course our new signing Jordan Ayew, obviously on loan from Swansea, and he was making his debut here in the place of the injured Wilfried Zaha. Now personally for me, considering the whole team, especially offensively, had a pretty poor game, and I don't think you can really argue with that, I actually think he was one of our more brighter players, and certainly I do think the 6 I'm going to give him certainly does sort of warrant the performance he made. Now in terms of his replacement, obviously he was replacing Wilfried Zaha in the side. You know, he's got, I think it was a thigh injury, and obviously if you look into it, he could be out for maybe 2, maybe 6 weeks. So with the international break, it's maybe not that bad. But of course, losing your talisman is going to have an impact on the side. And as you heard in the the things we learnt from the game, that section of the podcast, is obviously we haven't won any games since I think it's 2016 without Wilf in the side, which just goes to show how important he is to the side. But even though you've got to replace someone as good as Wilfried Zaha, I still think Jordan Ayew was a more than good enough replacement, and that's why I was happy we signed him from Swansea, because even though he obviously got relegated, he was their top scorer, he was their players' player of the season, and I think the fans' player of the season, and he won goal of the season as well. So it just goes to show that actually he's a good quality player, and the reason I was excited when he joined the club is just the fact that he gives us another option when someone like Wilfried Zaha is injured, and certainly that's what he done here. I thought, as soon as I heard the news that Wilf was injured, I said, fair enough, bring Jordan Ayew in, because he gives us a slightly different option and basically makes up for the fact that we haven't got the creativity and pace of Wilf. And I certainly think he done that. You know, he looked lively, which is obviously what we expect from Wilfried Zaha, and he sort of tried to get Palace's attacks going. He tried to get us going, and that's basically what Wilfried Zaha does. You know, our tactic obviously sort of, or our whole team, not just tactics, but our whole team revolves around Wilfried Zaha, and obviously most of our attacks are either started by him, finished by him, or involve Zaha. And that's exactly what Jordan Ayew did. And, you know, considering the whole team were playing pretty badly, the fact that we've got someone like Jordan Ayew who's still trying to get things going, even though the team's not really playing that great, that's obviously great to see from a player. And, you know, the fact that he worked his socks off, you know, tried to give his all for the team on his debut was, of course, great to see. Now, of course, he's not on Wilfried Zaha's level, and I'm not saying he is, but the fact we've now got a good replacement off the bench. You know, last season we had no options, and we had to play Andros Townsend up front for some parts of the season when Benteke was injured, when Zaha was injured. Obviously we've had to play Wolf up front and, you know, change up the midfield a bit. So of course now we can play our system, we can play our 4-4-2, but because, even though when Wilfried Zaha was injured, because we've got Ayew, we've got a good replacement to bring not only off the bench when, you know, Zaha or Benteke has to come off, but also we've got someone who can start the game in the absence of either striker. Now, personally for me, considering it's his debut and, you know, obviously we lost the game, he still gave his all for the side, tried to do his best, and although he didn't necessarily look that great inside the box in terms of, you know, getting on the end of chances, he certainly was one of Palace's more creative players in the sense that he was creating chances for his opponents, especially, you know, Benteke. I think that together they may not be the perfect partnership, but I do think, you know, they were starting to sort of form some sort of relationship with each other. Now, of course, I think personally for me, Benteke hasn't been playing well, and I think it's the final straw, and I'm going to talk about him later. But I still think when Wolf comes back from injury, I think it's quite obvious that Jordan Ayew needs to play alongside him, because Jordan Ayew, in his sort of, I think it was about 60 minutes he played, 60-70 minutes he played here, I think he showed a lot more in that time than Benteke has had this season. And I don't think Benteke's had a bad season so far in his performances. Yes, he's been bad in front of goal and missing chances, but performances have been good. Whereas Jordan Ayew, he's having good performances which are better than Benteke, and he showed with Swansea that he's a goal scorer, and he's also shown that actually in a system, you know, playing sort of off another striker, he can work really well. And personally for me, when Wolf comes back from injury, if Benteke doesn't start scoring goals, I think that Jordan Ayew and Wilfried Zaha should play up front, because not only I think they will sort of credit each other and work really well together, I think they can actually really complement each other. That's the word. I think they can complement each other really well, because they both got pace. They're very good at sort of getting in behind and very skillful. So I think that'd be really good to see. But personally for me, Jordan Ayew, one of the better Palace players on the day, and certainly does deserve his 6. Working his socks off, you know, looking very lively, you know, running down the channels, trying to get into the box and get chances. And although he didn't have that many chances, the fact that he showed the energy, the intensity, and tried to get things going in attacks, that's the thing personally for me that really did impress me with his performance. Now I'm going to move on now to the final player, obviously, of our front two in the 4-4-2 formation, and that is of course Christian Benteke. Now this is a guy who's going to come up for lots of criticism. He's very sort of controversial at the minute, but personally for me, I just want to get it clear. I don't think he's a bad player, and based on his performances, he's not a bad player. But obviously, you're a striker, you're paid a lot of money, you're there to score goals and to get assists, and he hasn't been doing that this season. So understandably, we're frustrated. Roy Hodgson's frustrated. But as he said in his press conference, he is our best striking option, so you've got to continue to play with him. Now, the reason I'm going to give him a 5 for his performance is, I know people have given him 3s and 4s. I've given him a 5 because I think the fact that he had good link-up play and his hold-up play was very good, and the fact that he had the chances in the first place, you know, a few, you know, we look back to Fulham, we look back to Liverpool, even you could argue, you know, last weekend against Watford, he had chances, he didn't really have that many chances, whereas in this game, he had loads of chances, and either he spilled them, you know, narrowly wide, or obviously he found the keeper in inspired form making loads of good saves. So although he struggled to make a real telling impact in the fact that he got an assist or got a goal, I still thought the fact that he had the headed chances, albeit they were missed, the fact that he's now getting into the box, getting into the right positions to get these chances, yes, they still miss, but that's a step in the right direction. You know, like I've said, beginning of this season, he weren't really getting any chances, whereas here he's now starting to get the chances. So the next step really for him is just to finish these chances. Now, ultimately, the headers he missed, you know, in front of the Homesdale in the second half against Southampton, they were sort of unforgivable, because a player of his quality should be sticking that in the far corner, not sort of headering it down to the ground where the goalkeeper is. Now, admittedly, it is a good save from the keeper, but he really, perhaps really needs to be doing better. Now, for me, I think you could argue he sort of was unfortunate not to get a penalty, because quite a lot in the in the first half, Southampton were getting very physical, once again playing their deep line. And obviously, 1 or 2 times Benteke got pushed to the ground. You could argue, yes, it was soft, and personally for me, I think it would have been a soft penalty to give away. But the fact still remains that he was running into the box. He's still trying to get on the end of chances, but ultimately, you know, the last man defends well against him, or he just fluffs his line. So it's not like he's not getting into the right positions. It's just the fact that he's not finishing his chances, and he just seems sort of bereaved of confidence at the minute. Now, to be honest, he's going to get lots of stick, as I've already said, and people are going to give him 3s, 2s, maybe even 1s out of 10. But personally for me, you know, you've got to look at it and go, actually, you know, we've sort of basically blamed him and sort of criticised him for not getting chances and not sort of finishing his chances recently. But now he's actually finally getting chances. Yes, he's not finishing them, but we've got to, you know, the fact that he's now hitting the target, like I've said already, is a step in the right direction, and it's better than what he's been doing sort of the end of last season and the beginning of this season. So, like I said already, as frustrating as it is, the fact that he's not scoring these chances, you've got to look at it both ways and go, actually, if you look at it, you know, in sort of my glasses, you've got to look at it and go, actually, he's not scoring the goals, not getting the assists, but actually he's improving slowly. He went from not having no chances, looking really bad, just running around the field, whereas now he's now running around, getting into the box, getting in the right positions, getting his chances, and although he's not finishing them well, he's obviously, the fact that he's getting them is obviously a good thing as well. Now, just to talk about two chances in particular, you know, there was one from a very tight angle. He created it himself, which is great to see. You know, the fact that he's got that strength and power to get past the defenders and create it himself. And obviously the second chance with that header down, he probably should have done better with that one. But they're two examples where actually, yes, one of them, the goalkeeper, was in good form, and the other one, you know, I think the defenders got in the way of it. But if you look at it from a different perspective, you've got to look at it and go, actually, if you ignore all of the bad games he's had recently, you've got to look at it and go, actually, he's still creating loads of chances, but unlucky not to finish them. Obviously, finding a keeper in inspired form. Now, I'm not trying to say that he's totally great, and I'm not trying to cover for him and make excuses for why he's having bad performances. I just sort of want to I don't want to put all the criticism on him, because some of his performances are good. It's just that he's not getting the end product. Now, overall, I think he did okay. You know, he wasn't really that great, wasn't really that bad, but I do think a 5 is a fair reflection of his game. And personally, for me, some of his stick is unwarranted. You know, I've seen people on Twitter absolutely slating him. Some of it is unwarranted in the fact that people are saying he's absolutely terrible, he shouldn't be at the club, we should sell him. But then I see other people who are more sort of, I wouldn't say more genuine, they're just sort of more realistic about it and go, actually, you've got to give this guy a chance. He's slowly getting better, and you know, in the next few games, if he doesn't score or assist or improve his performances, yes, that's fine to drop him, but you've got to obviously give him the chance, given the fact that he's putting in slightly better performances than he has done before. And, you know, as I've said already, my final bullet point is, you know, he done alright, but you could argue he should have had a penalty as well. And if he had won a penalty, would fans be moaning if we had scored from the resulting penalty? So, once again, football, you know, it's not just about kicking the ball about the game, it's all about game-changing moments that could have changed the game. You know, if he had won that penalty, we could be 1-0 up, and maybe the whole sort of confidence from winning that may have changed the game. So once again, it's moments that could change the game for and against Palace. So once again, you've got to look at the whole picture and not just look at the fact that he hasn't scored goals, so he must be bad. If you look at it in a slightly more sort of broader picture, you go to appreciate some of the stuff he does. Now, once again, I want to say, you know, because I know people will slate me, but I don't want to say he's brilliant, but obviously I don't think he's bad as well. So you've got to give him the benefit of the doubt for some aspects of his play, and obviously for others, understandably, he hasn't really been that good enough. Now, in terms of the subs, obviously Kouyaté came on, as I've already mentioned, so did Meyer, and obviously Alexander Sorloth came on as well. Now, both Kouyaté and Meyer, I'm going to give them 7s, because as I've already mentioned quite a lot, they came on the pitch and obviously changed the game drastically. And of course, Alexander Sorloth came on at the same time as Meyer, but I don't really think he had a real impact on the game, so I'm not going to give him a rating overall. Now, in terms of Kouyaté, I think as soon as he came on the pitch, he made an impact, not just because of his physicality, but the fact that he had a very good shot from distance, and it obviously, McCarthy, who was very quiet throughout the game, in the fact that we didn't really test him too much, he obviously was forced into a save, which of course, if he had come on and scored that, it would have been an immediate impact. And obviously, aside from the few shots he had, which of course tested the goalkeeper, something which we hadn't have done earlier on in the game, I also think he made some good runs from midfield. Now, ultimately, he's a central defensive midfielder who can obviously play in defence, but he's also very good at driving from deep and going forward, and that's exactly what he done, and that's exactly what we were missing in that sort of first half, beginning of the second half. We were missing someone who could make good runs from the midfield, come from deep, carry the ball forward. You know, the fact that he had that physical presence and the fact that he was winning the ball and just looked very bright overall in his play really just goes to show what sort of player he is and how much of an impact he made on the game. And you know, I talked about Luka already, you know, in the fact that he kept misplacing loads of passes. Kouyaté, on the other hand, his passing was a lot better than Luka's in this game. Obviously, you could argue Luka's passing is better, but in this game, it was obviously exhibited that Kouyaté's passing was slightly better. And the fact that he came onto the pitch for Townsend, obviously I questioned it at the time, but now looking back, it was actually a good substitution, because he made quite a positive impact on the game. But as I've said already, a very physical presence, which obviously gave Palace a bigger sort of domination and control on the midfield. And certainly, like I've said already, even though he plays quite deep as in his natural position, I do think he was making some very good runs going forward. Obviously, Max Meyer came on. I've given him a 7 overall. Obviously, loads of Palace fans were calling for him to come on, and I personally would have either liked to see him come on at half-time. And if Roy was wanted to persist with the team, which I totally understand why he would want to do that, I would have at least liked to see it sort of happen in sort of the 60th, maybe even the 50th minute, because it clearly wasn't working. Now, just looking back at the subs, you know, Kouyaté came on in the 72nd minute, Max Meyer and Alexander Sorloth in a double substitution came on in the 75th minute, which just goes to show that Roy Hodgson just leaves it too late and leaves us with little time to really try and get back into the game. So if he had brought on Max Meyer, as the crowd was shouting for, as I personally was begging for, he probably would have had more time. He would have had more time to make an impact, and the fact that him and Kouyaté made so much impact in that sort of small, sort of 15 minutes they had on the pitch, if he had brought them on sooner at half time, like I've already said, probably would have had a bigger impact on the game. Now, in terms of Meyer in particular, you know, I talked about Kouyaté bringing that physical presence in the midfield. I thought that Meyer sort of brought his technical qualities to the field in terms of his nice passing, his nice touching, but obviously he couldn't help Palace to sort of slip to defeat. And, you know, once again, it goes back to that point in the fact that Roy Hodgson, he's a good tactician in terms of sitting out the team, but his in-game management is not very good. He should have clearly seen, you know, if the fans can see that it's clearly not working, surely the manager should be able to see that. Now, whether it's because he's stubborn or wants to stick with his system, whatever it is, he should have been able to see that it wasn't clearly working, and he should have brought these players on. Now, personally for me, I asked for him to bring these players on, he'd done that, but in my opinion, he'd done it too late, and obviously he left them with little time to make an impact. But personally for me, I certainly do think, given the fact that we had so much domination in the last sort of 50 minutes or so, and the fact that we had so many shots on goal, I have no doubt that if these guys had been brought on maybe the 50th, maybe even the 60th minute, just them few minutes earlier, I think they could have had a real bigger impact on the game. And of course, Alexander Sorloth, I touched on it already, came on for RU 75th minute. Not really too much to talk about him, basically because he came on, tried to help Palace rescue something, and although he won loads of headers, he didn't really have that much impact on the game, and that's why I don't really think I can really judge him, so I can't really give him a rating overall. Now, to be honest, just to sort of give you an overall summary of the game, obviously just to give you sort of my overview and my overall opinions, I personally don't want to talk too much about the game, because the game was lost because obviously we weren't playing that great, and actually it was both teams weren't really playing that great. It was just that Southampton took their chances well when Palace sort of switched off. But to be honest, I don't want to talk too much about the game, because the game wasn't lost because of the quality. I think that we lost the game because of Hodgson, and I think a lot of the blame does lie with him, not because he's a bad manager. It's just because this game, the sort of squad selection was quite poor. And of course, we should have sort of started with the lineup that either finished at Watford or the one that finished the game here. So I personally, in that starting 11, given the poor performances of someone like Jeffrey Slopp, I would have liked to see someone like Max Meyer or Kouyaté come into the side, because obviously they were very good against Watford, and certainly because of the impact they made here, it was quite obvious that if they had started, it would have been much more different. And obviously, for me, it would have been nice to see a team that finished so well against Watford. Ultimately, we didn't get anything from the game, but when you have a team that finished so well, it would be nice to bring that into the next side. And ultimately, I think it's quite obvious to say, anyone can look at any sports and say, at the end of the day, you've got to pick your best team. And our best team, I think, in my opinion, includes Jeffrey Slopp off the bench to give us some sort of impact. And of course, it includes starting Max Meyer in his position. Now, I don't want to sort of completely hammer Jeffrey Slopp, but him in particular, I'm not sort of just scapegoating him, but him in particular shouldn't really have started this game, considering his performances against both Liverpool and Watford. And even though he was alright midweek in the Cup, I still think them two performances in the Premier League was enough for me to say actually his performances is not quite to the right level. Now, another really problem I have with Hodgson is the fact that he takes too long to make changes. Now, I've already talked quite a lot in depth about it, but just to sort of go over it briefly again, Max Meyer, Kouyaté quite simply should have either started the game, as I've already mentioned, or come off the bench earlier, because I think that they are them two players in particular are part of our best starting 11. Now, obviously, we're not quite sure at the minute what our best starting 11 is, because if we play a 4-3-3, we could have a midfield three of Meyer, Kouyaté, and maybe McArthur or Luka. But then if we play a 4-4-2, we're limited to two central midfielders. So, of course, it's quite difficult to say what your best 11 is, but I do certainly think Max Meyer, or either one of Max Meyer and Kouyaté, should be obviously part of that strongest 11. But sadly for me, it's really Hodgson's only weakness. Like I've said already, I think tactically and in the fact that he's got the experience, that's all great. But it's just his squad management, his game management, and obviously the squad selection sometimes is his only weaknesses. Now, like I've said already, we've got the international week coming up, so hopefully that will give Hodgson a time just to shake it up for the next game against Huddersfield. And like I've said already, because you've got the likes of Jeffrey Stark not performing well, because you've got a 2-week period, you either need to improve him drastically or just be bold and just put the players in who have played well. Ultimately in football you've got to reward the players who are playing well. So if Meyer and Kouyaté are playing well and Sorloth off the bench is proving to be slightly more effective than Benteke, you've got to make these changes, because it's got to be positive for us going forward. If we make these changes, if we make changes which relate to our best starting 11 or our best 11 that plays in the game, then of course that would be great for us going forward. And another point really for me is, the players I'm talking about that should be in our best starting 11, they're new signings, and it just goes to show how 3 of our signings in particular, we haven't seen enough of Vicente yet, but it just goes to show that 3 of our signings we made look like good additions, and that just once again goes back to the point that actually our summer business was very shrewd, and now we've got, obviously Hodgson hopefully will see this, but he now needs to utilise these players because they've shown quite clearly that of course they can be good players for us going forward. Now the final point really I want to touch on before I end this and go on to talk about my man of the match, just like I've already mentioned it briefly, but we just need to use this international break to regroup, fix the issues, as well as sort of changing the team, as I've already mentioned, and hopefully with that, with a few players going on international duty, it will really help Hodgson just to get with the side, really fix the issues, and hopefully the likes of Meyer and Kouyaté, we get to see them in the next few weeks. So I'm now going to move on to the Man of the Match award. But before I do that and give you my man of the match and why I thought had the biggest influence in the game, I'm now going to give you the 4 nominations I put forward for the award. Now, as I do every week, I go on to talk about the performance and why I think actually, because the performance was good, there are so many players I could put on this shortlist, and it was pretty hard to decide who to put on there. This game was the complete opposite in the fact that actually the performance was very sort of lacklustre, lackadaisical, if you may, and because of that it's really difficult to pick 4 players, mainly because overall as a team performance it was quite disappointing. But I've managed to come up with 4 players who I think, considering it was a bad overall team performance, tactically and just the performance on the pitch, I think that these players did stand out for me considering the overall sort of bad performance from the team. So I've gone with Wayne Hennessey, Aaron Wan-Bissaka, James McArthur and Cheku Kouyaté, obviously as my 4 players. And obviously just to start with Wayne Hennessey, obviously like he's been doing this season, he's had a fantastic start to the season and once again was making lots of saves in that first half, including there was one terrific save I think from it might have been from Ings, I think, or maybe Redmond. So once again, like I said with Hennessey, like I've said last week, he keeps making crucial saves, and that's exactly what he done here. And the fact that he also saved Charlie Austin's penalty as well, yes, he did dive to his right as opposed to staying down the middle, but the fact that he was able to make himself big, stretch to make sure that he could use his legs because the ball was going down the middle and flick it away so that Palace could clear it, that was also good as well. So the main reason he's on there, it's just because he stood out for me in the fact that he made so many crucial saves in the game, which meant that we didn't lose the game by even more goals. And of course he saved a penalty, which I must say, considering this was his first ever penalty save for Palace, we've got to give him a bit of praise for that, because certainly saving a penalty is a thing for goalkeepers that could really boost their confidence. So hopefully, even though he is playing well at the minute, hopefully that can boost his confidence even more. Now obviously Aaron Wan-Bissaka, I've put him in again, and I put him in midweek. He's absolutely fantastic. He's only played 11 games for Palace, but game after game he seems to be getting better and better. And that's not just with his defensive play, but where once again his defending was great. He was obviously stopping the opposition in Southampton from actually getting down at Palace's right hand side. So he's done a great job there. But I thought offensively, as he's been doing in the last few games, he was probably one of Palace's better players, because I talked about a few weeks ago in the fact that he needs to sort of push up more and try and put more crosses in and just try and get a bit more involved offensively, and he's done exactly that in the last few games, and this game especially against Southampton he done it to perfection. Down that right hand side he caused lots of problems in terms of his pace and getting in behind, but also in terms of his deliveries from wide. Quite a number of times he was putting in crosses into the box, and that's basically what I said a few weeks ago. I said this guy is constantly getting 7 and 8s out of 10, but if he just added that final end product with crosses from that right back role, he would have 9 out of 10 performances every week. And he's now started to do that in his game, and that's one of the main reasons he's on this man of the match shortlist, is the fact that not only defensively was he good in terms of stopping Southampton, but actually in terms of getting behind them and creating goal-scoring chances with his crosses, he was also great at that as well. Now obviously I've gone with 2 midfielders as my final 2 players, obviously starting with James McArthur. To be honest, this was a player who's sort of up to debate. Some people think he had a good game, some people thought he was pretty average. Personally for me, the fact that he's on this shortlist just shows you that I actually think he had a really good game. And actually for me, alongside Hennessey, Wan-Bissaka, I think you could argue he was probably one of Palace's best players who actually played on the pitch for the majority of the game. Now once again, like with Wan-Bissaka, I thought defensively he was very good, and offensively he was good as well. So defensively, McArthur, playing that sort of box-to-box role like he's done in recent games, very good at actually getting back and sort of giving that protection to the back four, as well as, you know, going forward and actually having chances. Now in terms of his offensive play, you know, he came quite close to the equaliser. So shortly after we conceded, he obviously got a shot, he got the ball on the edge of the area, tried to curl it top corner, and it obviously came off the bar. So really it just shows that actually not only defensively he can make tackles and just sort of win possession in the midfield, but also if you give him the chance on the edge of the area, he can try and hit it. And that's the main reason I've put him on this shortlist. It's not because of his overall play being good, it's just the fact that he took chances, you know, rather than sort of hesitating when a chance came to him on the edge of the area, rather than sort of faffing about and just trying to pass it out wide. He just took his chance, and it was really unlucky that it came off the bar. And it would have been nice to see sort of that from a few other players, because I think our overall attacking play wasn't great. But if we had just done that slightly more, like what McCarthy did, when a shot comes to you, don't hesitate, try and just finish that chance straight away. If we see more of that from the team, we probably would have been converting a lot more of the chances from the ones we created, because that's not our problem. Our problem isn't creating chances, our problem is scoring from them. So if we see more performances like McArthur's, where not only does he have good energy, but he just takes his chance rather than hesitating, just takes it straight away, we could obviously have ultimately come back into this game, and maybe because of the amount of chances we had in the final third, in that sort of final quarter of the game, we probably could have gone on to get a draw from the game, or even go on to win the game, purely based on the fact that the amount of chances we had. But because not all players were like McArthur and taking their chances, obviously that ultimately meant that we obviously went on to lose the game. Now Tricky Kouyaté is a player who came off the bench. I was very impressed with him when he came on, and ultimately when I first saw him coming on, I think it was for Andrews Townsend, I was quite disappointed. I'm like, Roy, what are you doing? You've got someone like Meyer on the bench who you could bring on, and I think would have more of an impact. But actually Tricky Kouyaté came on and really surprised me. You know, he was very bright, and much like McCarthy, he was winning the ball and was just making his sort of physical presence known to the opposition. So by him coming on and us taking off an attacking threat in Townsend, we basically got a bigger control of the midfield, because we had a big physical presence in there. But also I think, you know, bringing someone like him on, once again, even though he's a defensive midfielder, I saw him driving forward so much throughout the game, which just goes to show that actually, even though he's a defensive midfielder, he's actually got that energy, and almost like McArthur, to actually drive forward and create chances. Now another reason I've put him on this shortlist, and probably because, you know, I was debating between him and Max Meyer, the reason I put Kouyaté in here ahead of him is just the fact that Kouyaté, as soon as he came on, much like McArthur, had a chance in the edge of the box. Rather than just hesitating and faffing about, he literally just rifled it. It was going top corner, and obviously McCarthy made a good save. So once again, it just goes to show, if you have a chance on the edge of the box and we were 1-0 down at that point, you just take your chance. And that's what I liked about Kouyaté. You know, coming off the bench, you obviously haven't sort of been down, let's say, about the fact that you're 1-0 down because you've been on the bench. So you've come on, it's time for you to make a difference, and certainly you did do that. But like I've said, for me, it was between the 2 substitutes in terms of who could go on the shortlist, you know, Kouyaté, Max Meyer. But the fact that I thought both players were good, but the fact that Kouyaté came on slightly earlier, so he had a bit more time to make an impact. And I think that when he came on, he drastically changed the game. Whereas when Meyer came on, he only changed the game a little bit, because of obviously how much Kouyaté sort of changed that dynamic and that sort of attacking field to the midfield. That's the main reason I picked him over him. But if I have to give sort of a notable mention to a player, it certainly would be Max Meyer, because I think coming off the bench, he obviously did have some sort of impact. But for me, I think it's quite obvious who I think the man of the match should be, and I think it's quite clear. And if you look on Twitter, I think most people are giving this player praise, and that is of course Wayne Hennessey. So congratulations, Wayne. you don't get a trophy or certificate, but you do get my sincere congratulations on what was once again a solid performance from you. But the main reason I've given it to him as opposed to Wan-Bissaka, McArthur, Kouyaté is just because of the amount of good saves he made throughout the game. Because with the amount of chances Southampton had, in the fact that they were better than us, if they had finished maybe even 2, maybe even 3 of them chances better, or Hennessey hadn't have made them saves, we could be looking at a 3-0 loss, you know. Really would have put a downer on the day. But the fact that Hennessey actually made these good saves, especially one really terrific one in that first half, as well as saving a penalty as well, is just the reason he's in there for me. You know, I think both Wan-Bissaka and McArthur were very good defensively, and obviously McArthur and Kouyaté, and even Wan-Bissaka to an extent, very good offensively. But I just think the fact that Hennessey, almost, so you could argue he was the guy who made the difference in us losing only 2-0 as opposed to maybe 3, maybe even 4-0. It's just the fact that how many saves he made, and of course the fact that he saved his first penalty for Palace. But overall, all of these players do deserve credit, but I do think Hennessey had that little bit more about him in the fact that he kept us in the game, kept us from being embarrassed basically by Southampton, and certainly does deserve the award. So now you've heard my match report, player rankings and my man of the match. That concludes this week's podcast. Now I've got interviews with Roy Hodgson and Wayne Hennessey following the game.
Wayne, unfortunate defeat today. Can you describe what it's like in the dressing room at the moment?
Everybody's head is down. 3 points massively missed for us there. We didn't get going from the start. Obviously, we managed to get in at 0-0 and maybe give it another push, but we started sloppy again and they punished us, and then we're always chasing. And obviously that led to the second goal when we were trying to push too many people forward to try and get that equaliser, and yeah, they punished us.
Can you believe that we didn't score today? It seems so many chances.
I know. Let's say Alex McCarthy played well in goals, made a few good saves, made a fantastic save off Christian's header. Yeah, unfortunately it just doesn't go in for you sometimes.
When you made that penalty save, which is I think your first penalty save for Palace, did you think that was going to be the springboard for the team to get some momentum and turn it around?
Yeah, like you're saying, obviously you need one little moment in the game for an uplift, and I do think we actually had a little uplift, but like you're saying, Alex played well in goal and the chances keep coming, and just didn't find the net.
We came across a very determined, a very aggressive and athletic Southampton team who asked questions of us, and unfortunately we weren't able to supply the answers.
How big a blow was the absence of Wilfried Zaha, particularly given that I understand his injury came very late in the week?
Really, it came yesterday, just before we finished training, so that was a blow, as is the blow to James Tompkins. We can argue that one, I suppose, that two of our better players are not available to us at the moment, and like all teams, when you lose 2 of your better players, you are weakened. But I still think we should have the wherewithal in our group and our squad to deal with those things, because injuries are going to happen, and Wilf Zaha has been fantastic in terms of his record. We haven't won a game when he doesn't play. We all know that one, and today I thought would have been a great opportunity to put that to bed in a way and get that monkey off our back, but we weren't able to do so.
You did have chances, as you say. Christian Benteke had a number of them, still can't quite get his goal this season. How much of it a difficult time is he going through, and how difficult is that for you as a manager?
Well, it's difficult for him in particular, and of course it's difficult for me and the team, because we want to see him scoring goals. He's certainly trying his best to get that goal, but somehow it won't just fall for him, or when he does get an opportunity, he narrowly misses, or the goalkeeper makes a good save. There's nothing we can do really except keep working at it and keep encouraging him to keep his game going. But of course, psychologically, these things do matter, and they do have an effect upon players, and the sooner he gets that goal and gets himself off the mark and his confidence improves, the better it will be for everybody.
So there you have it. Now you've heard what Roy Hodgson and Wayne Hennessey had to say after the game. That concludes this week's podcast for the game against Southampton. But make sure to come back in 2 weeks' time for my post-match review of the game against Huddersfield. So thanks for listening, and remember to up the Palace.